If an ordinary American somehow managed to save every single penny of a congressional salary, never bought groceries, never paid rent, never filled a gas tank, never paid a medical bill, and never spent 1 cent on the basic cost of being alive, that person would still need roughly 14 centuries to accumulate $250 million. Nancy Pelosi spent 37 years in Congress, and that enormous gap between public salary and private fortune is exactly where Senator John Kennedy began. Not with a theatrical accusation, not with a stack of dramatic exhibits, but with a legal pad, a pen, and one brutally simple question. Ma'am, where did the money go? The room was already full before Pelosi arrived. The cameras were running. The gallery was watching, and she entered with the familiar posture of someone who had spent decades walking into rooms where power usually moved around her rather than toward her. She carried a leather folder, reading glasses, and the practiced composure of a politician who had answered thousands of questions, survived thousands of attacks, and learned how to make scrutiny look like background noise. Kennedy was already waiting, without the entourage, without the pile of briefing binders, without the visual armor of Washington, sitting there with nothing more complicated than arithmetic. Pelosi sat down, opened the folder, placed the glasses on her face, and settled into the hearing as if this were another familiar exercise in controlled testimony, another afternoon where prepared answers would keep everything inside the usual boundaries. Kennedy leaned toward the microphone and made the opening sound almost harmless, saying he had only a few questions, simple questions about numbers, the kind of introduction that should have been easy for someone with 37 years of public experience to handle. Pelosi answered the first one cleanly. Her congressional salary was $174,000 a year, the same salary paid to every other member. Kennedy wrote the number down slowly, not because anybody in the room needed help remembering it, but because the entire argument depended on forcing the numbers to sit next to each other where nobody could hide from the comparison. Then he asked for her estimated net worth, and suddenly the easy arithmetic stopped being comfortable. Pelosi pointed to the public financial disclosures, the documents that had been available for years, but Kennedy did not ask whether the documents existed because the existence of paperwork was not the issue sitting in front of him. He asked her to say the number into the microphone, in front of the cameras, in front of the people watching, because a figure buried in disclosures feels very different when spoken aloud beside a public salary of $174,000. Pelosi acknowledged that some estimates had placed the number as high as $250 million, and Kennedy wrote that down too, putting the second figure directly underneath the first, as if he were balancing an account that had already started screaming before he touched the calculator. He reminded her that he had served for 17 years as Louisiana State Treasurer, where money was not treated as political poetry, where bond issues, disbursements, and public dollars were expected to add up at the end of the day. Then he delivered the point without decoration. This number did not add up. Even if somebody took $174,000 and multiplied it across 37 years, the result would be only about $6.4 million before taxes, before housing, before food, before travel, before the endless expenses of ordinary human existence. Against a fortune described at more than $200 million and sometimes as high as $250 million, the congressional salary became almost irrelevant, a narrow stream beside an ocean of accumulated wealth. Kennedy let the room perform the calculation for itself, because the arithmetic was more damaging when the audience reached the conclusion without being dragged there by political rhetoric. He pointed out that saving every dollar of that salary would require more than 1,400 years to approach the fortune being discussed, an absurd span of time that stripped away every comfortable attempt to pretend the difference was small. His joke about the Roman Empire and Washington's missing money tree worked because underneath the humor was the same stubborn question: what produced the gap? Pelosi did not accept the premise quietly, and her response was immediate, sharp, and familiar, calling the line of questioning ridiculous, and insulting while directing the explanation toward her husband, Paul Pelosi. She argued that Paul Pelosi was a venture capitalist who built financial leasing services, managed investments, worked with companies, and created wealth in the private economy long before this hearing placed their household finances under a microscope. Her position was straightforward. His business success was not her scandal, and the wealth of a congressional spouse could not automatically be converted into evidence against the member of Congress. She also pushed the partisan point back across the table, noting that wealthy Republicans existed in Congress too, and challenging Kennedy on whether the same interrogation would be applied to them. For a moment, the counterattack gave Pelosi exactly what experienced politicians usually want in a hearing like this, a way to transform a question about her own numbers into an argument about fairness, gender, and selective scrutiny. Kennedy did not take the bait, and that restraint mattered because he did not need to defend every wealthy Republican in America to continue examining the figures sitting in front of him. He acknowledged that Paul Pelosi might be an excellent investor, even saying that building a successful business deserved respect, but then moved immediately to the part of the record that made the explanation more difficult rather than easier. According to the figures presented in the script, the Pelosi household portfolio returned approximately 70% in 2024, while the S&P 500 returned about 25%, a difference so enormous that it transformed the discussion from ordinary investment success into something requiring much closer examination. Kennedy then pointed to 2023, when the household portfolio was described as gaining roughly 65%, again far above the broader market. The point was not that a skilled investor can never outperform an index, but that repeated, extraordinary outperformance becomes harder to wave away with the single word success. Kennedy framed the comparison in the language of professional investing, where elite fund managers spend careers trying to beat the market by a few percentage points and celebrate when they manage to do it consistently. Against that standard, a household portfolio beating the market by dozens of percentage points does not look like routine competence. It looks exceptional enough that asking questions becomes the obvious response rather than some outrageous breach of etiquette. Pelosi maintained that her husband's investment decisions were his own and that she had no prior knowledge and no subsequent involvement in those transactions. A defense, she said, had been stated publicly and repeatedly. Kennedy did not claim that her statement itself proved misconduct, and he did not need to, because his method was to keep narrowing the gap between the official explanation and the extraordinary numbers. He simply returned to the mechanism that made those numbers politically explosive. Members of Congress operate inside a system where disclosure does not occur instantly. The Stock Act requires covered trades to be disclosed within 45 days, meaning the public can spend weeks unaware that a congressional household has bought or sold a major position. Kennedy turned that delay into the next pressure point, emphasizing that 6.5 weeks can be a very long time in financial markets, especially when legislation, regulatory action, committee decisions, and corporate news can move billions of dollars before the public sees the paperwork. His Louisiana analogy was deliberately simple. If someone buys land and the government builds a highway next to it 44 days later, people in the neighborhood are going to start asking questions whether or not anybody has yet proven what the buyer knew. He was careful not to say that Pelosi had told her husband anything, but he also refused to pretend that a disclosure system with a 45-day window somehow eliminates the appearance of an advantage. By the time he looked back at the legal pad, the hearing had moved beyond the original salary question, because now the issue was not merely how much money the household had accumulated, but how consistently that money appeared to move in the right direction. Pelosi sat with the folder still open in front of her, yet the prepared pages were becoming increasingly irrelevant because Kennedy was not asking questions that could be neutralized by reading a polished statement about public service. The glasses remained on her face, but the hearing had shifted away from anything that required reading and towards something much harder to manage. A sequence of numbers placed beside each other without enough political fog between them. Kennedy turned to another page, and the sound of the paper itself seemed to mark a transition from broad wealth to specific performance, from the size of the fortune to the pattern behind it. He had spent less than 10 minutes establishing 3 facts inside the script's argument. The salary did not explain the wealth, the household returns dramatically exceeded the market, and the disclosure rules allowed substantial time to pass before the public could see the trades. The ledger was open now, and Kennedy was no longer asking whether the Pelosi household had done well. He was asking how it had managed to do so well, so often inside a system where political power and market timing could never be treated as completely separate worlds. That was when Kennedy turned from the general pattern to the specific dates, because broad percentages can be dismissed as luck, skill, or selective framing, but a calendar is harder to blur once the dates are placed in order. He looked down at the next page of the legal pad, where company names and transactions were already written, and shifted the hearing toward timing with the same controlled tone he had used from the beginning. In November 2023, according to the script, Paul Pelosi purchased 50 call options in NVIDIA, a position designed to profit if the company's stock moved higher and a large enough wager to deserve attention when examined beside what Washington was doing around the semiconductor industry. Kennedy did not need to explain options like a Wall Street analyst because the basic point was brutally simple. The household had made a significant bet on a major chip company, and federal policy was moving enormous amounts of money toward that same sector. The question was no longer whether NVIDIA was a good company or whether millions of ordinary investors also owned shares. The question was why the Pelosi household's timing kept appearing so favorable when legislation and political authority entered the same frame. Pelosi's defense was immediate and predictable. NVIDIA was one of the largest companies in the world. The investment thesis surrounding semiconductors was public, and the CHIPS legislation had been openly debated rather than hidden in some back room. Kennedy did not dispute that the legislation was public because he did not need secrecy to make his argument about timing. His point was that Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, controlled the House floor schedule, while her household was simultaneously participating in markets affected by legislation moving through that institution. The script framed the CHIPS and Science Act as involving roughly $280 billion connected to semiconductor investment and incentives, creating precisely the kind of overlap that ordinary voters would examine with suspicion even if no illegal communication had been proven. Kennedy's attack depended on that distinction. He was not producing a confession. He was putting the trade and the legislative calendar on the same page and forcing the audience to look at them together. Pelosi called the implication outrageous, but Kennedy kept returning to the disclosure forms rather than escalating the accusation beyond what the script provided. He said he was simply reading her family's disclosures aloud, an answer designed to strip the exchange of the protective language politicians often use when they want to turn uncomfortable facts into complaints about tone. Then he widened the pattern, mentioning Visa stock sold before an antitrust lawsuit and Alphabet calls purchased before a committee vote, each example presented as another line in the same calendar rather than as a separate scandal requiring a new theory. The argument was cumulative, not because any one transaction automatically proved wrongdoing, but because repetition was the entire point Kennedy was building. If the household kept landing on the favorable side of major developments, the audience did not need a lecture in securities law to understand why the pattern demanded scrutiny. Kennedy reduced that scrutiny to another one of his blunt lines, saying that if he were a gambling man, he would want Paul Pelosi's calendar. It was sarcasm, but controlled sarcasm because the joke only worked after the dates had already done the damage. Pelosi had entered the room prepared to answer accusations in the language of legality, public disclosure, spousal independence, and partisan fairness. Yet Kennedy kept dragging the exchange back into the language of sequence. First the trade, then the government action, then the profit. That structure was politically devastating because legality and appearance are not the same thing, and a public official can remain technically within a rule while still leaving the public staring at a system that looks designed to reward people closest to power. The script's accusation was not that Kennedy had exposed a secret wire transfer or produced an incriminating email. It was that he had exposed how much suspicion could be created without any secret document at all. Pelosi then changed direction and reached for reform, saying she now supported banning stock trading by members of Congress and their families. She pointed to legislation and her own vote as evidence that she had accepted the need for stronger rules, an argument intended to move the hearing from past conduct toward present reform. She also reminded Kennedy that Republicans had traded enormous amounts of stock and that some of them served on committees affecting the industries in which they invested, once again trying to widen the frame beyond herself. That response had force because the problem described in the script was never limited to a single party, and even Kennedy acknowledged her vote rather than pretending reform was meaningless simply because Pelosi supported it. But Kennedy's answer attacked the timing of the reform itself, arguing that changing the rules after decades of benefiting under the old structure did not erase what had already happened. According to the script, the Pelosi household had turned roughly $30 million into approximately $278 million before the embrace of a trading ban, and Kennedy used that sequence as the next pressure point. His analogy was savage because it was deliberately uncomplicated. Supporting a prohibition after the fortune had already been built was compared to robbing a bank every Tuesday for years and then voting to outlaw bank robbery on Wednesday. He was not claiming the analogy established a criminal offense. He was using it to attack the political value of reform that arrives only after the people writing the rules have already accumulated the advantage. That was why his next line mattered more than the joke itself. The law might change future behavior, but it does not return the money already made under the system being condemned. Pelosi's reform argument, therefore, did not close Kennedy's ledger. In his framing, it confirmed that even defenders of the old system eventually recognized that the system could not survive public scrutiny forever. Then, Kennedy introduced the phenomenon of the Pelosi trackers, services and apps that follow publicly disclosed trades associated with the Pelosi household and allow retail investors to mimic them after disclosure. According to the script, retail investors who copied those filings in 2025 were said to have earned returns around 72%, a number Kennedy used to underline how extraordinary the household's reputation for market timing had become. His line about strangers copying Paul Pelosi's homework and getting A's was mocking, but the underlying accusation was far more serious than the laugh line. Ordinary investors had begun treating the disclosed trades of a political household almost like a market signal. That phenomenon existed in the script not as proof of insider trading, but as evidence of public perception. And public perception is especially corrosive when citizens begin to believe political proximity itself is an investment strategy. The more successful the copied trades appeared, the harder it became for Pelosi to dismiss every question as merely partisan theater. By that point, the folder in front of Pelosi had become little more than scenery because the exchange was no longer following the prepared path she had brought into the room. Kennedy summarized the structure he had built. Pelosi controlled the House floor schedule, her household invested in companies affected by legislation, and those investments repeatedly produced extraordinary returns. Pelosi could call those connections coincidence, independence, or the normal activity of a sophisticated investor, but Kennedy's argument was that a long enough sequence of favorable timing stops feeling random to the people forced to watch it from outside the building. He reduced it again to the calendar, the ordinary object that turned Washington complexity into something anybody could understand. A calendar does not prove motive, but when transaction after transaction appears to line up with government action, it gives the public a reason to ask why the people making the rules always seem to know how to prosper under them. Kennedy had now filled the first side of the ledger. income that did not explain the fortune, returns that dramatically outpaced the market, and trades that the script repeatedly placed near consequential government action. But he had not reached the argument he considered larger because personal wealth was only one half of the picture Kennedy was constructing. The other half was spending, the enormous federal bills written, negotiated, scheduled, and passed by people who controlled institutions capable of moving trillions of dollars through the economy. If the first section asked how private wealth could grow so aggressively around public power, the next section asked what happened when that same public power decided where taxpayer money would go. Kennedy turned the page again, and this time the subject was no longer the Pelosi household portfolio, but the government ledger itself. He set the legal pad down, picked it up, and set it down again, a small shift before moving into the part of the hearing where the numbers became less about investment percentages and more about political priorities. Pelosi removed the reading glasses from her forehead, folded them, and placed them beside the open folder, signaling that whatever prepared material remained inside was no longer controlling the exchange. Kennedy announced the next subject plainly: spending, beginning with the HEROES Act and its roughly $3 trillion price tag during the pandemic period. Pelosi was ready to defend the legislation as emergency relief for families, state and local governments, unemployed workers, small businesses, testing, and the broad national response to an extraordinary crisis. Kennedy was ready to ask something narrower and more dangerous to the political image she had spent decades building. Not whether Washington spent money during the crisis, but what else had been packed into the spending, who benefited, and what those choices revealed about the distance between the people writing the bills and the people paying for them. Kennedy opened the spending section with the HEROES Act, roughly $3 trillion proposed during the pandemic, a bill Pelosi defended as emergency relief for families, workers, local governments, testing programs, unemployment assistance, and businesses being crushed by shutdowns. Kennedy did not deny that the country was in crisis, and he did not pretend emergency spending itself was illegitimate because that would have weakened the point he was trying to make. Instead, he focused on what had been packed beside the emergency relief, pointing to provisions involving stimulus payments for undocumented immigrants, permanent nationwide mail-in voting, and a Silicon Valley subway extension connected to Pelosi's district. His argument was brutally simple. When Congress tells the country a bill is an emergency lifeline, every item inside that bill deserves to be judged against the emergency being used to justify the price tag. And once a local transportation project appears inside a massive pandemic package, Kennedy's question becomes unavoidable. Was every dollar really about rescuing families, or had Washington once again learned how to use a crisis as cover for priorities that would never survive the same scrutiny on their own? Pelosi answered from the strongest ground available to her, reminding Kennedy that COVID had brought economic devastation on a scale the country had not faced in generations, and that federal officials themselves had urged Congress to act aggressively. She pointed to checks sent to struggling families, support for businesses, vaccine funding, and the millions of Americans who depended on Washington when their income disappeared almost overnight. Her counterattack forced the moral question directly back at Kennedy. Would he rather Congress had done nothing while families were losing jobs and businesses were collapsing? Kennedy refused that trap, acknowledging that the crisis was real, that the checks were real, that the vaccines were real, and that Americans genuinely needed help. But acknowledging the necessity of relief did not require him to pretend that every decision made under the banner of relief was wise, clean, or remotely connected to the people who were being told to wait. Kennedy then moved to the Paycheck Protection Program replenishment, describing a $250 billion effort for small businesses that Pelosi's party blocked on a Thursday, while business owners around the country were desperate for cash to keep employees and stay alive. Then he moved to Friday, because the sequence was the point, and according to the script, that was when Pelosi appeared on late-night television standing in front of an expensive freezer in her San Francisco kitchen. Inside were rows of premium ice cream, and Pelosi smiled as she talked about how much she loved it, while millions of Americans were living through one of the most financially terrifying moments of their lives. Kennedy did not attack ice cream because ice cream mattered. He attacked the image because images expose political distance faster than policy papers ever can. A Washington leader defending blocked business relief one day and appearing beside a freezer worth more than many Americans earned in months the next day created exactly the kind of contrast that no communications team can successfully polish once the public sees it. He asked what the hairdresser in Madisonville, Louisiana, was eating that Friday after her shop had been closed, and what the body shop owner in Baton Rouge was feeding his children after his income had been cut off. Those were not abstract economic units or charts on a congressional briefing page. Kennedy framed them as ordinary people making ugly choices between rent, food, payroll, and survival, while powerful officials remained insulated from the cost of the rules they defended. The expensive freezer and 13 pints of ice cream became symbols because they sat on the opposite side of that divide, not because wealth itself was illegal, but because the contrast was politically obscene. Kennedy invoked the nickname Nancy Antoinette, a phrase built to capture the perception that Pelosi had become so removed from ordinary financial pressure that she no longer understood how the scene looked to people outside her world. The insult landed because the public did not need Kennedy to explain why smiling beside luxury during forced economic pain could look less like leadership and more like contempt. Pelosi rejected the characterization and insisted that she had spent her career fighting for working families, but Kennedy immediately moved to another episode from 2020 that made the same argument in a different form. He brought up her visit to a San Francisco hair salon at a time when local lockdown rules had closed salons, emphasizing that she entered the business, received service, and was seen without a mask. Kennedy made a point of saying he did not begrudge anyone a haircut, because once again the haircut itself was not the accusation. The accusation was the existence of one rule for the public and another reality for the powerful, a pattern that becomes devastating when citizens are being fined, shut down, or driven out of business for behavior political leaders appear able to treat as optional. The moment mattered because hypocrisy during a crisis does more damage than ordinary hypocrisy. People who are sacrificing income, freedom, and routine do not forget seeing the people writing or defending the rules escape the same burden. When the security footage became public, Pelosi said she had been set up and argued that the salon owed her an apology, a response Kennedy presented as even more revealing than the original visit. He turned the attention toward the salon owner, Erica Cusey, described in the script as a single mother who faced threats, financial fallout, and eventually relocation after the controversy exploded. Kennedy's point was not merely that Pelosi had been caught inside a closed business, it was that the power imbalance became unmistakable when the person with the national platform demanded an apology from the small business owner whose livelihood had already been battered. To Kennedy, that response exposed the same distance he had been building from the freezer episode. The rules could destroy someone else's business, yet the political figure who crossed those rules still saw herself as the injured party. That was the pattern he wanted the room to understand. Because wealth and power become especially corrosive when the person holding both can no longer recognize the difference between accountability and victimhood. Kennedy then added the timing of Pelosi's television appearance later that same evening when she criticized the president for not following masking guidance after she herself had been filmed inside the salon without a mask. The contradiction was so direct that Kennedy did not need to inflate it, and in fact the less theatrical he made it, the worse it looked. He had spent the hearing using exactly that technique. Put the action on one line, put the public statement on the next line, then stop talking long enough for the audience to notice the gap. Pelosi's reading glasses now sat folded beside the open folder, while the prepared statement remained untouched because the argument had moved far beyond anything a pre-written defense could easily contain. Kennedy was turning separate controversies into one cumulative indictment of political insulation, using money, timing, spending, luxury, and rule breaking as different entries in the same ledger. By this point, the hearing described in the script was no longer about one transaction, one bill, one freezer, or one salon, because Kennedy had deliberately connected each episode to the same underlying question about power. The salary did not explain the fortune. The portfolio repeatedly outperformed the market, trades appeared beside political decisions, emergency bills contained priorities beyond immediate relief, and public restrictions seemed to operate differently when they reached the people enforcing or defending them. Each individual episode had an available explanation, and Pelosi had offered several of them, but Kennedy's argument was that explanations become less persuasive when every explanation happens to protect the same person from the same conclusion. One coincidence can be coincidence, one profitable trade can be skill, one embarrassing television appearance can be bad optics, and one rule violation can be dismissed as confusion. But pile enough of them together across decades, and the public stops asking whether each episode can be individually defended and starts asking why the defense is always necessary in the first place. Kennedy closed the spending section and opened a blank page, signaling that he was ready to stop listing individual entries and begin calculating what they meant when added together. He told Pelosi that after roughly 40 minutes, he no longer saw isolated incidents. He saw what he described as a machine, a structure where public authority, private wealth, legislative timing, and political insulation repeatedly occupied the same space. Income that a congressional salary could not explain sat beside trades that appeared unusually well-timed, while massive spending decisions carried benefits and priorities shaped by the people who controlled the legislative machinery. Separately, every line could be defended. Paul Pelosi was a skilled investor. Timing could be luck. Emergency spending could be necessary, and political leaders could make mistakes just like anyone else. Kennedy's attack was that after 37 years, when every road kept leading toward the same accumulation of power and advantage, calling the entire pattern coincidence required more faith than the numbers themselves. He described that pattern as architecture, not because he was claiming to have uncovered a secret blueprint, but because architecture is what a structure looks like after the pieces are intentionally placed beside one another. Pelosi had controlled the House floor schedule. Her household had invested in major companies. Those companies operated in sectors affected by congressional action, and federal spending bills moved staggering amounts of money through the economy and into districts represented by the people writing them. Kennedy argued that machines do not run themselves forever. Somebody builds the rules, somebody maintains the system, and somebody inevitably learns how to benefit from it better than everyone standing outside the door. For 37 years, he said, the machine had not broken down, and the individual who had accumulated one of the most striking fortunes in American congressional politics was now sitting directly across from him. That was where Kennedy stopped counting individual entries and prepared to ask the final question the entire hearing had been designed to reach, because the ledger was nearly full and only the balance remained. Pelosi's eyes dropped toward the table, toward the open folder and the glasses resting beside it, and for the first time, the posture that had carried her through decades of congressional combat looked less like command and more like calculation. When she finally answered, she did not return to NVIDIA, the Stock Act, the Salon, or the freezer, because Kennedy had already connected those pieces into a larger accusation that could not be dismantled by addressing one line at a time. She reached instead for the full weight of her career, reminding the room that she had become the first woman to serve as Speaker of the House, helped pass the Affordable Care Act, participated in the legislative response to the financial crisis, and led Congress through the pandemic. Her point was that 37 years of public service could not simply be reduced to a spreadsheet of wealth, transactions, spending bills, and embarrassing moments. It was the strongest emotional defense available because it moved the argument away from numbers and toward legacy. Kennedy did not mock that legacy, and he did not pretend those accomplishments had never happened, because dismissing them would have given Pelosi an easy escape from the question he had spent the entire hearing constructing. He acknowledged her title, her power, and her service, then stripped the exchange back down to the one thing she still had not explained to his satisfaction. "I am questioning your math." That sentence cut through every credential and every historical achievement, because Kennedy was not asking whether Pelosi had held power or whether she had passed important legislation. He was asking how a congressional career built around a salary of $174,000 could coexist with a household fortune measured in the hundreds of millions without the public demanding a much clearer accounting. Kennedy returned to his own experience as Louisiana State Treasurer, not as decoration and not as another biography lesson, but because his entire attack depended on presenting himself as somebody who understood what a clean ledger was supposed to look like. For 17 years, he said, his job required money coming in and money going out to be accounted for, every line visible, every imbalance investigated, every unexplained gap treated as a problem rather than a political inconvenience. That was the standard he now placed against Pelosi's record, and his conclusion was viciously simple. Her ledger had pages missing. He was not saying that 37 years of public service disappeared because the arithmetic looked ugly, but he was saying that public service did not create immunity from arithmetic. Titles could command respect, legislative victories could fill history books, and political longevity could produce monuments, but none of those things answered the financial question sitting on the table. Then Kennedy picked up the pen again and moved toward the final line, asking why, if Paul Pelosi truly operated as a completely independent investor, the trades still appeared on Nancy Pelosi's disclosure forms under rules governing members of Congress. Pelosi opened her mouth, but according to the script, nothing came out. Kennedy waited, and the silence became more damaging than another argument because every earlier defense had depended on having an answer ready before the question finished landing. He waited 3 seconds, then 5, allowing the room to feel the absence rather than covering it with another speech. Then he returned to the question that had been hanging over the entire hearing from the beginning. "Ma'am, where did the money go?" At that point, the question no longer functioned as a request for one missing figure, because Kennedy had spent the hearing transforming it into a judgment about the entire structure surrounding congressional wealth and power. The salary was only the first column, the investment returns were the second, the timing of trades was the third, and the spending controversies completed the pattern he wanted the audience to see. The script's case was not built around one alleged smoking gun, one secret recording, or one confession that suddenly proved everything. It was built around accumulation, the argument that enough favorable transactions, enough convenient timing, enough privilege, and enough public-private overlap eventually stop looking like disconnected episodes. Kennedy's weapon was not volume, because he never needed to shout once the numbers had already been arranged in the order he wanted. The hearing ended with the reading glasses still folded on the table beside the open folder, and the prepared statement that had seemed so important when Pelosi arrived had become almost meaningless by the time the camera stopped. She had entered prepared to read, prepared to respond, prepared to survive another political confrontation using the same discipline that had carried her through decades in Washington. Kennedy's approach was different because he did not try to overpower her with louder accusations or bury the room under ideological speeches. He treated the confrontation like an audit, moving from income to wealth, from wealth to performance, from performance to timing, and from timing to the exercise of public power. That structure was what made the attack difficult to deflect, because political rhetoric can be dismissed as partisan, but arithmetic continues sitting on the page after everybody stops talking. And that was where the script widened its target beyond Nancy Pelosi herself, because the deeper accusation was not that one politician became wealthy, but that Washington had created a system capable of producing the same suspicion again and again. Members of Congress from both parties hold investments connected to industries affected by legislation and committee oversight. And the problem does not become clean simply because the name on the disclosure form changes from Democrat to Republican. The script argues that Pelosi became the most recognizable symbol of that system because of the scale of her household wealth, the extraordinary attention surrounding Paul Pelosi's trades, and the decades she spent near the center of congressional power. The machine Kennedy described therefore survived the individual hearing because changing one politician does not automatically change the incentives surrounding everyone else. The uncomfortable question is not merely whether Pelosi benefited from the system, but why elected officials were allowed to participate in a system that predictably destroys public trust even when no criminal case has been established. The script then returns to what it calls the Antoinette paradox, the idea that decades inside political power can stretch the distance between officials and ordinary citizens until the people at the top no longer understand why the people below them are furious. The freezer mattered because Pelosi apparently saw nothing politically disastrous about displaying luxury during a period when businesses were closed and families were calculating whether they could afford rent. The salon mattered because the controversy was not merely that she entered a closed business, but that her response placed blame on the salon rather than acknowledging how the scene looked to people who had been ordered to obey the same restrictions. That disconnect in the script's argument is what happens when power becomes normal enough that privilege stops feeling like privilege to the person possessing it. The scandal is therefore not simply wealth, but the inability to recognize why ordinary citizens might look at that wealth, the rules, and the timing and decide the system was never designed for them. That is also why Kennedy's background mattered so much to the framing, because Pelosi had spent decades surviving reporters, television hosts, activists, political opponents, and congressional enemies who could always be dismissed as partisan combatants. Kennedy arrived with the vocabulary of accounting rather than outrage, and the script presents that difference as the reason the confrontation became harder to neutralize. An accusation can be attacked, a commentator can be insulted, and a political opponent can be written off as motivated by elections, ideology, or revenge. An audit works differently because it does not require the person being audited to confess. It only requires the lines to be visible enough that the audience can see where the balance becomes difficult to explain. Kennedy's strength in the script was therefore not his accent, his jokes, or even his most memorable insults, but his decision to keep returning to the same ledger after every attempt to move the conversation somewhere safer. Somewhere in Baton Rouge, the script imagines an ordinary worker coming home exhausted, sitting at a kitchen table, paying bills, and watching politicians with fortunes he cannot comprehend. Explain why questions about those fortunes are unfair. He does not need a securities law degree to understand the emotional core of the issue, because he knows exactly what happens when his own numbers fail to balance. His mortgage company does not accept a speech about public service. The electric company does not care about historic accomplishments, and the grocery store does not allow him to substitute prestige for payment. That is why the question Kennedy asked carries beyond Pelosi, beyond one hearing, and beyond one political party, because citizens who are forced to account for every dollar naturally resent a political class that appears offended when asked to do the same. After 37 years, hundreds of millions in household wealth, spectacular investment returns, controversies over timing, and a career spent at the center of federal power, Kennedy reduced everything to the question the script says Washington avoided for far too long. Ma'am, where did the money go?